John chapter 18, verse 28 to chapter 19, verse 16. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves, and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge.
Start again. If you have a Bible with you, please turn in it to that passage that Isabel read for us, which is in John chapter 18, and it begins at verse 28 and runs through to chapter 19 and verse 16. And one of the things that I want to do in this sermon today is pick out some of the key phrases for you that are used in this passage that John has written down for us. Now, the first thing is that the phrase that is used very often here by Pilate and by others is the notion that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Now, we start this passage with this strange thing where the Jewish leaders lead Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. And because it was early morning and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. And so they are very concerned to please God in what they are doing. And that is something that they have in common with us. If you are in church today, you are at least partially in church because you are intent in your life to please God. And sometimes in our lives of pleasing God, you come to a dividing point. Which way should you go? There's a very famous baseball player from the 1950s, a gentleman who was nicknamed Yogi, and his surname is Berra. And one of the things he was known for, as well as being a great baseball player, is that he had an immaculate gift of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or managing to say something that didn't make sense. And so, for example, one of the things that he is noted for saying is, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. Now, think about that, because it means nothing. If you come to a fork in the road, you do have to choose. There is no way of knowing which fork to take unless you choose. Now, if Jesus truly was the King of the Jews, he was at the very least the king over the people who were making this decision, and probably in terms of the language of the Bible, he was God himself. Now, it is impossible to please God without choosing to follow God. And to choose obeying your religion, if that contradicts God's way, is a nonsense. One of the reasons that I believe that Christianity is true is that it involves the invisible God, who is spirit, taking on flesh and being revealed to us. And so if you say to me, what is God like? I wouldn't start in the Old Testament, because if God is invisible and spirit as he is, then that makes him a little harder to understand and to recognize. But if Jesus is God come in the flesh, then if you look at Jesus and his example, it becomes much easier to see what God is truly like. You know, sometimes you have religions where they say, I will serve God by acts of violence. And in various times there have been those who claim to be Christians who have chosen to do this. Now, I'm not here getting into an argument about whether a war can ever be just. I'm talking about individual acts of violence to serve God. And if you look at Jesus and who he was and what he taught, it becomes very obvious that to stay close to him, you cannot live like that. And therefore, for these leaders who sought to be close to God, to remain outside of the palace in order to be religiously clean to come close to God, whilst Jesus was under trial, makes no sense at all. Somebody said to me the other day that they said, oh, well, I'd like to know your opinion about this. She said, the last musical I went to see in the West End was The Book of Mormon, which is like fairly light-hearted musical that pokes a little bit of fun at the Mormon church. And she said, I really enjoyed it, but I wonder what you think of it as a religious person. And I said, well, you know, I never really think of myself as being religious. And that sounds kind of very strange coming from somebody who's a church pastor. But we should be people of faith far more than we are religious. If the rules that we make for ourselves lead us away from the tenets of our faith, then somewhere along the line those rules have gone wrong. One thing in our society which has also gone wrong is that the idea of truth has become very relative. There's a Welsh rock band who you may never have heard of, but they're a good example to throw in at this point, because they recorded an album quite a few years ago now called This Is My Truth, Now Tell Me Yours. A band called the Manic Street Preachers. Nothing to do with Christianity, that's just their name. And when you think about that, this is my truth, now tell me yours, it says that truth is not a universal thing. Truth is a absolutely universal thing, or it is not truth at all. A preacher, American preacher that I greatly admire, who started a ministry in Switzerland a number of years ago, a guy called Francis Schaeffer, wanted to be so careful that people understood him that he started to refer to true truth, because he wanted people to understand that there is truth that you can bet your bottom dollar on, because truth does not change. Things that were true 2,000 or 4,000 years ago are true today. And so we are in this situation where truth has been relativized now. We shouldn't be surprised that there were signs of that all those years ago when Pilate said, "What is truth?" Truth comes again from the character of God. If you want to know what is true in this world, look at God. Do not, he said, shooting himself in the foot, do not look at the church. Because one of the things that you will see in the church is what the church is saying shifts all the time. And that is why some churches and some cult groups create for themselves a head of the church whose voice is higher than the revelation of God in the scriptures. And so therefore, you can always be in line with the times. And so when you see in the newspapers or in the Christian press or on the Christian radio, whatever is the source of your information, and it says, this church has decided that in future we have decided that this is appropriate, and it disagrees with Scripture properly interpreted, then you can know the church has gone wrong. It's very important to know that it is very, very possible to misinterpret Scripture, and therefore sometimes it is the case that the church was wrong in the past and right now. One of the classic examples was over the issue of slavery. If you went to the deep south of the United States of America at the time of the Civil War, they would have said to you, well, God is white, and therefore black people are not made in the image of God in the same way that white people are. And therefore black people being slaves is perfectly appropriate. We end up back where we began. God is spirit, and God is invisible. And so the notion that when God made all of us in his image, the whole notion that God made some people closer to his image than others is complete and utter nonsense. And you don't have to take my word for it. You have to take the word of the Bible for it. And when the church has said otherwise, it is not only wrong, it is horribly wrong. And when the church bolsters those kind of hideous, hateful ideas in society, how bad is the church? The next thing that is here, that is an important phrase, is free Barabbas. Say, fascinating part of the story that there was this man who had led an insurrection. The other Gospels tell us a little bit more about him, but I won't get into that today because that's a different part of the story. But this man had been arrested because he had tried to overthrow the government of Rome. And not surprisingly, since Rome was the big power, the strong power, he had failed. And he'd ended up in prison, ready to be executed over this time of celebration. It's interesting that this, how do you do to mark a celebration? There's been talk about an extra bank holiday if England should win tonight in the football. Bank holiday sounds like a great idea. But the whole idea, public holiday for Passover and other things. Let's have some crucifixions. It's not quite the same thing at all, is it really? And so we've got one too many prisoners. We can set somebody free. Now, the interesting thing for me here is something that is not at all obvious. But assuming that Barabbas has its roots as a name in the Hebrew language, it would literally mean son of the Father. And Jesus is being put on trial because he claims to be son of the Father. Only his Father is Father in heaven. Barabbas was probably called Barabbas because, and whisper this quietly, nobody knew who his father was. So whereas people, if their father was Joseph, would be called Bar Joseph, Bar Abbas would mean, and preachers didn't ought to say this kind of thing, which is probably what I'm going to say, he was kind of a bastard on all kinds of levels. And so there's a good film out there. It's a long, old film. I think it was probably made in the 1950s. Kirk Douglas, who, for you young uns, you might know Michael Douglas, who is the son of Kirk Douglas. Or you might know Catherine Zeta-Jones, who is the wife of Michael Douglas, who is the son of Kirk Douglas. And Kirk Douglas played Barabbas in a fictional story about him being set free on this first Easter weekend. And the story comes to its conclusion with Barabbas sitting on a hillside, looking down at the crucifixion scene and thinking, why am I set free while somebody suffers in my place? And that should be our attitude if we are Christians. Why am I set free while somebody suffers in my place? And the answer is the grace and the love of God is the only reason that we know that come Judgment Day, we have no penalty to suffer because the penalty has already been taken on the cross at Calvary by Jesus. It's not a good day for mentioning penalties because by the end of the day, if England lose, we might be really sick of the talk of penalties when somebody blazes one over the bar or something. But the really important penalty has already been dealt with. One of the interesting things that comes across in this passage much better than it does in the other Gospels is the notion of those who shouted, "Free Barabbas." Sometimes if you see a television program or a film that depicts the events that were leading up to the crucifixion, there's a huge crowd of people shouting, "Free Barabbas." This passage makes it clear that it was only the leaders and their servants. And servants, like always, don't get much option in what they shout. They shout what their masters tell them. And they shouted, "Free Barabbas," which was bad enough. But when Pilate asked, "Shall I crucify your king?" the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And this brings us back to where we were a few weeks ago in our sermon when we were talking about expediency. There will be crucial moments in your life where you will either choose for God or you will choose for a peaceful life. And the expedient way is to choose for a peaceful life. You think, I can keep quiet and I can serve God another day. And it's noticeable that the chief priest didn't say, "He's not our king. He's not the king of the Jews." They just simply said, "We have no king but Caesar." And so life is full of decisions. Decisions at work, decisions at school, decisions at university, decisions in church, decisions in your home life. All of them are based on the notion of whether you will accept Jesus as your substitute, as the one who has paid the penalty for you. You know, there was a little moment in the football semi-final the other day when the England manager had brought somebody on as a substitute, and then England scored and went in front, and all of a sudden they needed defenders more than they needed attackers. So the substitute who had come on was taken off again. And there was a little interview with him afterwards, and he said, "You know, I would really like to have been on the field at the end, but it was more important for me what benefited the team." And in that way, we are a team as Christians. We are here to encourage and to build each other up, but we are also here to serve God in everything we do. And sometimes by our silence, and sometimes by our actions, and sometimes just by our denials, we effectively say, "We have no king but Caesar." This is what truly matters to us. I can worry about God another day. So first of all, make sure that even though you'd be like to be the guy who scored the winning penalty at Wembley, if God thinks it's better for somebody else to take it, then you accept that and you allow Jesus to be your substitute. It's a whole less painful. And secondly, never stay quiet when it is a case of denying your God. Sometimes it is good to stay quiet, because sometimes you are not denying something, you are just simply avoiding an argument over something that would not be beneficial to anybody. But sometimes we opt for peace when it would be better to stand our ground. Everything takes a little wisdom and a little thought to figure these things out. Let's be prepared to think and to serve God in every situation. Amen.